Chapter 1. Stay on your knees and let the rain cleanse that poisonous heart of yours. No one is allowed to give her an umbrella. The man who barked this order was Calvin White, the man I'd spent years hopelessly in love with. And the one kneeling in the storm, drenched and trembling. That was me. The rain poured down in sheets, stinging my skin and blinding my eyes, but despite it all, I started to laugh. A sharp, unexpected laugh that rose from the pit of my chest. It wasn't bitterness or despair. It was a joy. Pure, unshakable joy. Because I had been given a second chance. I'd gone back in time, back in the day when the White family and my family were finalizing wedding plans. Back to the day when everyone thought I didn't deserve Calvin. And honestly, they weren't wrong. The gap between our lives couldn't have been wider. When I first met Calvin, he was the only heir to the richest family in Sea City, a man who had everything handed to him on a silver platter. And me? I was just the daughter of a bankrupt family, left picking up the pieces after our business collapsed years ago. The only reason our fates became tied together was because my parents had passed away, saving Mrs. White's life. Out of gratitude, Mrs. White insisted Calvin marry me. It wasn't love. It wasn't even respect. It was duty, plain and simple. When the news broke, everyone pitied Calvin. They called it a tragedy. A cruel twist of fate. Calvin himself didn't bother hiding his resentment. So, when the engagement became unavoidable, he retaliated in the pettiest way possible. On the day of the typhoon, he locked me outside in the storm. "Joanna, do you even realize how out of your league you are?" His friends didn't hold back either. "She's ruining his life." One of them scoffed. "There are a million ways to repay a favor. Why does it have to be marriage?" And Calvin didn't stop them. Of course, he didn't. He hated me more than anyone. In my previous life, I didn't fight back. I didn't argue or defend myself. I just knelt there in the rain all night, from dusk until dawn. By the time morning came, I was feverish and barely conscious, collapsing into the mud. When Mrs. White finally heard about it from the servants, she tore into Calvin, berating him for hours. By the afternoon, she dragged him to the courthouse herself and forced him to marry me. It was the most humiliating day of his life, and he made sure I'd pay for it. The wedding itself was a mess. Calvin's true love, Noelle, showed up in the middle of the ceremony. "Calvin," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "If I asked you to leave with me right now, would you?" His bloodshot eyes told me everything. But in the end, he shook his head, his voice barely audible. "Noelle, I can't. My parents' wishes come first. This is the end for us." Noelle's face crumpled. She let out a bitter laugh, reached into her bag, and pulled out a bottle of pesticide. Before anyone could stop her, she drank it all in one go. Calvin shouted her name, trying to stop her, but it was too late. All he could do was hold her as her body convulsed in his arms, blood spilling from her lips. Her white dress was stained crimson by the time her body went still. From that moment on, I became the villain in everyone's story. The woman who ruined a perfect love. The one who drove Noelle to her end. In Calvin's eyes, I was the reason everything fell apart. And he made me pay for it. For years, he humiliated me, tormented me, and treated me like dirt. I wasn't allowed to leave the house or speak to anyone. Every day, he forced me to kneel in front of Noelle's memorial, reciting apologies for sins I didn't commit. He'd find new ways to hurt me, forcing me to eat foods I was allergic to, just to save me at the last moment. "Now you know what she felt," he'd say. My body became a map of scars, each one a testament to his cruelty. When I finally couldn't take it anymore, I begged for a divorce. His answer was always the same, a cold, mocking laugh. "You think you can escape me? Never. Joanna, as long as I'm in pain, you'll be in pain too. That's the only way Noelle can rest in peace." For nearly 20 years, I endured that nightmare. A life of constant abuse, humiliation, and isolation. I was nothing more than a punching bag for his grief. In the end, I saw no way out but take my life. When I finally found my chance, I threw myself into the sea. but my soul clung to the world, heavy with resentment, tied to Calvin like a shadow. And that's when I saw the truth. Noelle hadn't gone. She'd faked her accident to pursue her modeling career abroad. Years later, she returned, alive and radiant, as though nothing had ever happened. Calvin? He was overjoyed. His grief vanished in an instant, replaced by love-struck devotion. The woman he had destroyed me for was back, and everything else including me was forgotten. He proposed to her again and again, buying her anything she wanted. A lavender field overseas, a diamond necklace worth millions, nothing was too much if it made her smile. Their love story became legendary. The media couldn't get enough of it. The dashing CEO and the stunning supermodel. The perfect couple. Their final engagement was broadcast everywhere. People called them soulmates, a match made in heaven. And me? I was nothing more than a decaying corpse at the bottom of the sea. My body was picked apart by fish while my soul festered with unresolved hatred. Then, one day, I woke up. The universe, in its infinite cruelty, had given me a second chance. But this time, I won't waste it. I won't cling to Calvin. I won't plead for scraps of love. I'll walk away, far away, and live the life I should have lived the first time. Chapter 2. The maids hovered near the windows, peering out at me, their whispers cutting through the rain. I didn't need to hear the words to know what they were saying. Their smirks, their condescending glances, everything about them screamed mockery. I didn't care. Not anymore. Ignoring them, I stood up, my legs trembling from hours of kneeling, and walked away. When I got back to my small rented apartment, I peeled off my soaked clothes and stepped into a hot shower. The water burned against my chilled skin, but I welcomed the heat. It was as if I could wash away not just the rain but also the humiliation clinging to me. Everyone knew the story. I was the pathetic girl who thought she could reach for someone out of her league. And for years, I played my role perfectly. I bent over backward for Calvin, always trying to make his life easier, always thinking of ways to please him. Every little detail, every small decision, I planned with him in mind. I knew he loved mountaineering. It was one of the few things that made him genuinely happy. But he was always too busy with work to go. So, I spent weeks staying late at the office, finishing his projects for him and clearing his schedule. I booked the best climbing gear, reserved tickets to the park, and even hired a guide. All because I'd overheard him say he wanted to see the sea of clouds from the top of the mountain, but in my last life, all that effort had meant nothing. The moment he found out I was the one who planned the trip, he refused to go. No hesitation, no second thoughts, just outright rejection. Instead, he went to the beach with Noelle. Her wishes, of course, always came first. And as if that weren't enough, I wasn't even allowed the dignity of staying behind. Calvin insisted I tag along as some kind of assistant, carrying their bags and catering to their every whim. That night, when the storm rolled in, Noelle accidentally dropped one of her earrings on the beach. Calvin ordered me to find it. I searched the shoreline for hours, the waves crashing around me, until one finally pulled me under. I would have gone if not for a passing patrol boat. By the time they dragged me out of the water, my lungs were filled with seawater, and I was barely breathing. I spent weeks in the ICU, fighting a lung infection so severe that doctors weren't sure I'd survive. It was a kind of helplessness I never wanted to feel again. Which is why, in this second chance at life, I knew exactly what I needed to do. Leave. Leave Calvin. Leave the humiliation. Leave the pain. I packed my bags quickly, stuffing clothes into a suitcase with trembling hands. I was done staying in a place that suffocated me. A friend had offered to let me stay with them for a while, and I was ready to take them up on it, but as I dragged my suitcase downstairs, ready to call a cab, I saw him. Calvin was leaning against his car, waiting. His dark eyes swept over me, landing on the suitcase in my hand. His expression hardened instantly, his mouth curling into that same familiar sneer that had once made me feel so small. Without a word, he strode over, grabbed my suitcase, and tossed it to the ground like it was trash. A low, mocking laugh escaped his lips. "Well, look at you," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Finally growing a backbone, are we?" I straightened, meeting his gaze head-on. "What do you want, Calvin?" He crossed his arms, his eyes narrowing. Shouldn't I be asking you that? What's this, another one of your games? Let me guess, run away for a few days, and then come crawling back, crying to my mother about how hard your life is. His words were sharp, cutting into me like they always did. But this time, I refused to flinch. Do you ever get tired of this? He continued, his voice rising. Do you really think you can manipulate me? If it weren't for my mother, do you think you'd have any power over me at all? I didn't answer. Instead, I calmly walked over to the trash can, picked up my suitcase, and dusted it off. Then I turned to face him, my voice steady and cold. Manipulate you? Don't flatter yourself, Calvin. Why would I waste my time on someone like you? He blinked, stunned into silence for a moment. It was a rare sight, Calvin, speechless. But before I could savor it, a soft, familiar voice interrupted us. Joanna, don't be like this. Noelle said as she stepped out of Calvin's car, her tone gentle and soothing, the way someone might speak to a child. Calvin didn't mean it when he made you kneel in the rain. He was just upset. You know how he gets. She approached me, her expression filled with pity. You two grew up together. There's a bond there. If you just talk to him, he'll listen. He wouldn't really make you kneel all night. Her words only made Calvin's glare sharpen. The disgust in his eyes burned even hotter. That look, it was the same one he'd given me the day he and Noelle became a couple. The same look of disdain, as if I was nothing more than an inconvenience. Back then, I'd fought with him, desperate to understand why he'd changed so much. His friends had turned the entire school against me, mocking me as a schemer, a liar. Noelle's friends had joined in, bullying me relentlessly while she stood by, pretending to be innocent. I'd tried to escape it all, retreating into myself, but Mrs. White misunderstood, thinking I was suicidal. She'd ordered Calvin to stay away from Noelle, but it didn't matter. The bullying continued. And Calvin? He'd just watched from the sidelines, never once lifting a finger to help me, shaking off the memory. I forced myself to focus on the present. I wasn't that girl anymore. I'm not running away, I said firmly. I'm going to climb mountain. That's all. Calvin snorted. Climb? That's the excuse you're going with? Before I could respond, Noelle touched his arm, her voice soft and sweet. Calvin, why don't we invite Joanna to the beach with us? She might feel lonely if she's by herself. I'm not interested, I said, cutting her off. I don't like the beach. I'm going climbing. That shut Calvin up. His mouth opened, and then closed, his irritation barely concealed. He took a deep breath, and then scoffed. Fine. Waste your time however you want. Noelle, stop bothering with her. She's not worth it. Noelle gave me a helpless, pitying look, and then stepped forward as if to hug me. But just as she reached me, she stumbled back, her heel twisting beneath her. Ah! She cried out, falling to the ground with a thud. Her delicate skin scraped against the pavement, leaving angry red marks. Tears welled up in her eyes as she looked up at me, her expression filled with heartbreak. I was just trying to help, she whispered, her voice trembling. I didn't think you'd push me. Chapter 3. Joanna, you're unbelievable. Calvin's voice was sharp, cutting through the silence like a blade. Before I could react, he shoved me hard. I stumbled backward and hit the ground with a sickening thud, pain exploding in my lower back. The impact sent a jolt up my spine, sharp enough to steal my breath. I gasped, clutching at the ground as the realization dawned, my tailbone. Something wasn't right, maybe cracked, maybe worse. But Calvin didn't stop. Do you think I owe you something? He snapped, towering over me, his voice dripping with venom. Do you think everyone owes you? Your parents are gone, Joanna. No one's here to cover for you anymore. And Noelle? She doesn't owe you a damn thing either. I didn't move. The pain radiating from my back made it hard to breathe, let alone argue. You're disgusting. Calvin continued, his words like acid. Being around someone like you makes me sick. I swallowed hard, forcing down the lump in my throat. I wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of seeing me break. Not again. You don't have to worry, I said, my voice cold and steady despite the sharp ache in my ribs. This marriage won't last much longer. I'll be out of your life soon enough. He sneered, his eyes narrowing in disbelief. Oh, really? I'll believe it when I see it. He turned away like he couldn't stand to look at me any longer. Then, with a deep breath, he bent down and scooped Noelle into his arms so effortlessly, so gently, it made my stomach turn. Without another word, he carried her to his car, slammed the door shut, and sped off, leaving me sitting alone on the cold pavement for a long time. I didn't move. The pain in my tailbone throbbed with every pulse of my heart, but I couldn't bring myself to get up. I stayed there, staring at the empty street, the silence pressing down on me. Eventually, I forced myself to stand. My legs wobbled under me, and every step sent a fresh wave of pain through my back. I limped to the curb and flagged down a cab, collapsing into the back seat as soon as it stopped. The ride to the hospital was slow and quiet. I leaned against the window, clutching my side, trying to ignore the pain. But my mind wouldn't stop racing. It was hard not to think about how far things had fallen. There was a time when Calvin wasn't like this. When I first came to live with the White family, he was the only one who spoke to me. I still remember how awkward he looked as he handed me a piece of candy, his voice soft and unsure. That small act of kindness meant everything to me. Back then, I followed him around like a shadow, always wanting to be close to him, always wanting his attention. In high school, Calvin was wild and fearless, the kind of person who made enemies without even trying. One day, after school, a group of boys cornered him behind the gym. They hated him, his arrogance, his confidence, his refusal to back down. I was walking by when I saw it, a steel pipe raised high, ready to come crashing down on his head. I didn't think. I just ran. I threw myself in front of him, and the pipe hit me square in the back. The pain was blinding, but I didn't regret it. Not when I saw the look on Calvin's face. He went ballistic after that, fighting off the group with a ferocity I'd never seen before. By the time it was over, they were on their knees, begging for mercy. Later, when I could barely move from the bruises, he stayed by my side, carefully applying ointment to my wounds, his hands trembling. He refused to let the matter go until the boys were expelled. That same Calvin, the one who once cared enough to fight for me, to protect me, was long gone. Now, he didn't think twice before pushing me to the ground or throwing insults my way. And yet, somehow, I wasn't surprised. I shook my head, forcing the memories away. There was no point dwelling on the past. Calvin had made it clear where we stood now. When Mrs. White returned, I'd convince her to let me leave. This marriage was a mistake, and I wasn't going to let it ruin me any more than it already had. Once I was done at the hospital, I realized some of my belongings were still at Calvin's house. I didn't want to go back there, so I called the housekeeper instead. Hello! A young maid answered, her voice timid, almost unsure. Hi! I said, trying to keep my tone polite. Could you pack up the rest of my things and have them sent to me? I'll pay you for the trouble. There was a long pause. I could almost hear her hesitation, the way she was likely debating whether or not it was worth the risk. The amount I offered must have tempted her because she was just about to agree. But then I heard a sharp voice in the background. Are you insane? Do you know what you're doing? You think you can just help her? The young maid stammered something, but the older voice cut her off. Do you want to lose your job? Helping someone like her, do you know how much Mr. White despises her? If the master finds out, you'll be out on the street. I sat there, clutching the phone, listening as the younger girl's voice broke into quiet sobs. I didn't hang up. Neither did they. The argument ended with the call being abruptly cut off. For a long moment, I just stared at the screen. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even surprised. Even the maids in that house knew whose side they were supposed to take. Calvin's hatred for me extended to every corner of his world. The call ended abruptly, cut off by the sound of scolding voices on the other end. I sighed, leaning back against the stiff hospital bed. My gaze drifted to the ceiling, blank and white, as if it could swallow me whole. Mrs. White was always busy running the family business, traveling for meetings, managing countless affairs. She'd raised Calvin on her own, but her absence created a vacuum. One he was more than happy to fill. In the White household, Calvin's word was law. From the moment I stepped into his house, he made sure everyone knew I didn't belong. No one was allowed to help me. No one was allowed to speak to me. I became invisible. Cooking, cleaning, laundry, I did it all myself. Even when I was sick or exhausted, there was no one to turn to. The maids would scatter like frightened birds the moment they saw me approach. But it didn't matter. I'd lived this way for over 20 years. I didn't need anyone's help. I stopped expecting kindness or sympathy a long time ago. Later, the doctor came to check on me. He flipped through my chart, his expression neutral but firm. "How much longer until I can leave?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He glanced at me over the rim of his glasses. "A fractured tailbone isn't something to take lightly. You'll need to stay a few more days to rest properly." I pressed my lips together but didn't argue. Eventually, the day came. I packed my things and returned to the Gu household to collect the rest of my belongings. The moment I walked through the door, the maids froze. They exchanged quick glances, their eyes darting toward me and then away as if I were a ghost haunting the halls. Not a single one of them offered to help. I didn't ask them to. I moved through the house quietly, packing up my things piece by piece. By the time I was done, my suitcase was bursting at the seams. I hauled it out myself, my arms aching, and loaded it into the cab waiting outside. From there, I went straight to my friend's apartment. I'd already canceled the lease on my old place. For the next few weeks, until the divorce was finalized and my paperwork to leave the country was ready, I'd be staying with her. When everything was done, when I was finally free, I would leave this place without looking back. A week passed. Then, one evening, Calvin called. His voice was rough and low, like he'd just woken up. Or maybe he was still drunk. "Where the hell have you been?" I didn't answer, but he didn't wait for one. "You know the place. Same room as always. Get here." The arrogance in his tone made me pause. I was at my desk, surrounded by visa paperwork and documents I still needed to sort through. My head was pounding from hours of staring at forms, and now this. "If you need something, just say it." I replied flatly. "I'm busy." The line went quiet. For a moment, I thought he'd hung up. The background noise, the faint hum of a television, muffled voices faded away. "Calvin." I said his name again, my patience thinning. Finally, he spoke, his voice sharper this time. "I asked you a question. Where have you been?" I sighed, leaning back in my chair, too tired to argue. "You said seeing me makes you sick, remember? So I've been doing you a favor by staying out of sight." I paused, letting the silence stretch between us. "Don't worry. The divorce papers will be on their way soon enough." I could hear him suck in a sharp breath, the frustration thick in his silence. Then came the sneer I'd grown so used to. "You think this little disappearing act of yours is clever?" he said, his tone dripping with mockery. "What happened to the woman who used to throw herself at me? Where did she go?" He didn't wait for a response. "Oh, I get it. You think playing hard to get will suddenly make me care. Let me save you the trouble, it won't." I stayed silent, still focused on figuring out how to speed up one particularly tricky document for my visa. "Let me make something clear," he continued, his voice hard and cold now. "Whatever game you're playing, it won't work. And if you even think about dragging Noelle into your mess, I won't let you off so easily." I barely heard him. My mind was still preoccupied with logistics. It wasn't until he said my name sharply that I realized I hadn't responded in a while. "What's the matter?" he taunted. "Scared now?" I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. "If you're scared, he continued. Then come back and apologize to Noelle. Beg her for forgiveness. Do that, and maybe I'll let you come with us to the beach next time. Don't worry, I said calmly, cutting him off. The paperwork will be sorted out soon. And when it is, I'll be as far away from you as possible. Before he could respond, I ended the call. Then, with a quiet sigh, I turned off my phone and set it aside. I had more important things to deal with. The visa was approved. I finally held the documents in my hands. Shortly after, I received news from the university I'd applied to. Without wasting a second, I scheduled an online interview. Studying at my dream school had always been a goal of mine, one I'd clung to in both this life and the last. While waiting for the interview results, I paced nervously, my thoughts a jumble of hope and anxiety. The moment the acceptance came through, I felt a surge of joy so pure it left me momentarily breathless. But just as I was about to text my friend to celebrate, Calvin's name flashed across my phone screen. Mom's back, he said coldly when I answered. She wants a family dinner. His words left no room for negotiation. Suppressing my irritation, I sent a quick message to cancel my celebratory plans and headed to the White household. The house was as cold and oppressive as ever. When I arrived, the maids opened the door without a word, their faces blank and detached. Walking into the dining room, I was met with a scene that felt all too familiar. Calvin sat stiffly at the table, his expression a mix of frustration and disgust, while Noelle stood beside him, her eyes red and puffy from crying. I didn't need to ask what had happened. It was obvious they'd been arguing before I arrived. The moment Calvin saw me, he stood, grabbed Noelle's arm and started toward the stairs. Lost my appetite, he muttered, his voice laced with disdain. I ignored him. His words had long since lost the power to hurt me. Instead, I quietly took a seat across from Mrs. White. It's been a while, I said with a polite smile. She returned the smile, though it barely reached her eyes. It has. My dear, you look so pale. Have you been eating properly? Is Calvin giving you a hard time again? I avoided her question, turning my attention to the food instead. The dishes tonight are amazing, I said lightly, hoping to steer the conversation away. Mrs. White sighed but didn't press further. Calvin just doesn't understand how good you are, she murmured, almost to herself. I studied her quietly. This woman had always treated me like a daughter, and in my previous life, she'd tried to protect me. When Calvin's cruelty became unbearable, she had wanted to help me escape. But by then, it was too late. Calvin had replaced her trusted staff with his own people, isolating her as much as he had me. When news of my accident reached her, the shock had left her bedridden with a stroke. I didn't blame her. She had tried. The fault was mine, I had been too blind to nave. Taking a deep breath, I decided it was time to speak. Mrs. White, I began, my tone steady but firm. I've been giving this a lot of thought lately. Her brows furrowed slightly, concern flashing in her eyes. Since the wedding, nothing has improved between Calvin and me. He hasn't changed how he feels about me, and the ceremony itself was humiliating. I hesitated for a moment before continuing. If things stay the way they are, we'll only grow to resent each other more. It's better to end it now. Divorce would give him the freedom to pursue what he truly wants. Mrs. White froze, her expression tightening as the weight of my words sank in. You and Calvin, she began, her voice trembling slightly. I've watched the two of you grow up together. Does it really have to come to this? Yes, I said softly but firmly, meeting her gaze. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then finally, she sighed a deep, weary sound that seemed to carry the burden of years. If that's what you want, I won't stop you, she said, her voice heavy with resignation. A strange sense of relief washed over me. It felt as though a boulder had been lifted off my chest. After dinner, I stood to leave. But before I could reach the door, Noelle stepped in front of me, blocking my path. Joanna, she said, her voice dripping with mock sweetness. You've been freeloading off the White family for years. Surely it's not too much to ask for you to do something useful for once? How about changing the sheets in Calvin's bedroom? I looked at her, unimpressed by her theatrics. There are maids for that, I replied flatly. I turned to leave, but before I could take another step, she grabbed my wrist and yanked hard. The next thing I knew, she collapsed to the floor with a piercing scream. Ah! It hurts! She wailed, clutching her stomach dramatically. Her cry was so loud it echoed through the house. Within seconds, Mrs. White and Calvin came running. Calvin's eyes immediately locked on Noelle, who was sobbing on the floor. He scooped her up in his arms, his expression dark with fury. Then he turned to me, his voice cutting like a blade. Joanna! I warned you! He snarled. I told you to stay away from Noelle, and yet here you are, hurting her again. Mrs. White stepped in between us, holding up her hands. Calvin, calm down. Joanna wouldn't do something like this. But Calvin wasn't listening. His fists clenched, his jaw tight with anger. Mom, why can't you see her for what she really is? He shouted. She's manipulative and cruel. She's been poisoning your mind since the day you forced me to marry her. He pointed a shaking hand at me, his voice rising. Look at her. She's vile. Before anyone could respond, Noelle let out another wail. Calvin, our baby. She sobbed, her voice trembling. Our baby is gone. Calvin's face turned red, his breath coming in sharp, shallow gasps. His eyes, bloodshot with rage, snapped back to me. You'll pay for this. He hissed. I swear you'll pay for what you've done. The chaos around me was deafening, shouts and accusations flying from every direction. My head throbbed from the noise. Enough! I stepped past Mrs. White, who was still trying to shield me, and walked straight up to Calvin. Before he could utter another word, I slapped him across the face. Take a good look at yourself, you idiot. I snapped, my voice cutting through the noise like a whip. His hand flew to his cheek, his eyes wide with shock. You don't need to worry, I said coldly, my tone sharp and unwavering. Soon enough, I won't be your wife anymore. Chapter 5. Calvin, how long are you going to be an idiot? Whether it was my slap or my words, Calvin was too shocked to react. After scolding him, I said goodbye to Miriam and left. As I reached the bus stop, I collapsed. The doctor had warned me to rest after my tailbone fracture. I had been busy with the visa application, staying up late and running around. Today, during the meal, Calvin had accidentally hurt me several times during the argument. The rush of blood to my head made me dizzy. Thinking about it, I really wanted to beat him up. From childhood to now, Calvin had always been biased, never believing me. Noelle liked to frame me. I had experienced it early on. Once she fell, and I helped her up, but she told Calvin I pushed her out of jealousy. I explained once or twice, but Calvin didn't listen, so I stopped bothering. This time was no different. I tried to stand up, but my vision was still dark. I waited quietly for my strength to return, then planned to call a cab to the hospital. At that moment, a pair of shiny shoes appeared before me. A strong hand helped me up. I'll take you to the hospital. Hearing this, I relaxed and passed out. I had met a kind person, so I didn't need to hold on anymore. When I woke up, I saw the same doctor from before. This time, he wasn't wearing a mask. To my surprise, he had a face that could rival a celebrity's. You're awake? You're really lucky. Hearing his voice, I realized he was the one who saved me last night. What a coincidence. Seeing me staring at him, he seemed a bit uneasy. Low blood sugar and low blood pressure, combined with old injuries and lack of sleep. You didn't realize how serious it was. I nodded, wanting to thank him, but Calvin's call interrupted me. His voice was filled with anger and sorrow. It's all your fault, Joanna. Noelle lost our baby. Why couldn't it have been you? Human emotions don't always connect. Listening to Calvin's desperate cries, I only felt annoyed. Actually, Calvin, you could have explained everything to your mother before the wedding. If she had known Noelle was pregnant, she wouldn't have wanted her grandchild to be a bastard. From the very beginning, you could have refused. You were the one who said you were willing to fulfill the marriage contract, and then you felt I was taking advantage of you. Everything is just a result of your own indecisiveness and hypocrisy. I was too good to you, too indulgent, making you lose your sense of direction. And by the way, Calvin, you're a complete idiot. With that, I hung up the phone. The dizziness returned. The doctor beside me supported me. You shouldn't get angry. Take deep breaths. During the examination, I noticed you have many small injuries. If you're experiencing domestic violence, I can help you report it. Looking at the righteous doctor in front of me, I said, no need to report it, but there is something else you can help with. He looked puzzled. What is it? Chapter 6. During my argument with Calvin, he mentioned that my existence was a hindrance, even as an ex-wife. Okay. That afternoon, I posted a photo of myself leaning on the doctor's chest. The caption read, "With you, I feel safe." As soon as I posted it, Calvin's friends, realizing the man wasn't Calvin, came to warn me. I turned off my phone and sincerely thanked the man in front of me. Thank you, Dr. Garrett. Your medical skills are excellent, and you have a kind heart. Dr. Garrett shook his head, a slight smile on his lips. You're too kind. After a few days of recovery, I planned to leave the hospital. Before I left, Garrett found me. Miss Joanna, is a verbal thank you all I get? I understood. What do you like to eat? My treat. I'm not picky, anything will do. Unfortunately, I had to go back and prepare for my studies abroad, so we set a date. On the day of our appointment, I wore a red dress I hadn't worn in a long time. In the perpetually cold climate of Russia, it would be hard to wear it again. Most of my things had been shipped, and I had said my goodbyes to friends. The rest I carried with me. During this time, Calvin's calls came one after another. Even blocking him didn't help. Unable to bear it, I finally answered, only to hear accusations. You promiscuous woman, already married and still fooling around. I laughed. He and Noelle had been entangled, yet he was quick to accuse me. You're ridiculous. Calvin no longer stirred any feelings in me. Calvin, I'm tolerating you out of respect for your mother. You're incredibly hypocritical. I married you, not sold myself to your family. I've already drafted the divorce agreement and sent it to you. It's you who refuses to sign. What? Divorce agreement? Calvin sounded incredulous. Mom won't agree. I sneered. Why don't you ask her? She agreed during that dinner. Calvin was silent for a moment. No, I don't agree. His refusal was surprisingly fresh. Your agreement doesn't matter. After a year, the marriage will be automatically dissolved. And I have evidence of your de facto marriage with Noelle. Even if it goes to court, we will divorce. Calvin, wake up. Your opinion doesn't matter. Chapter 7. Miriam called to ask if I could forgive Calvin, but I refused. Ending this marriage was a relief for me. During my meal with Garrett, I was very happy. He was knowledgeable and cultured. At the end of our conversation, he suddenly said, Miss Joanna, I know this might be abrupt. But, would you marry me? I was stunned. Just as I was hesitating, Calvin burst in. He punched Garrett in the face. So you're the one she's been seeing. Fortunately, Garrett was quick and dodged. I stood between them and shouted at Calvin. Are you crazy? Calvin grabbed me. I thought you were just angry with me, but you're really involved with someone else. I shook off his hand forcefully. Are you stupid? I've made it clear, we're already divorced. Calvin looked hurt. You're yelling at me for another man. I was exasperated. Should I be protecting you? We're divorced. I don't love you anymore. Calvin stubbornly shook his head. I don't believe it. And you killed my child. I won't let you get away with it. I had to spell it out. You need to use your brain. There are so many cameras at home. Can't you check them? I was planning to divorce you that day. Why would I go after Noelle? Look into it properly. The one who betrayed you isn't me. With that, I pulled Garrett away, but Calvin blocked us again. You're not leaving. Garrett stepped forward, worriedly supporting me. Be careful. It's easy to lose the baby at this stage. Should we call the police? I looked at him, then quickly understood his intention and covered my stomach. Calvin, if you hurt my baby, I'll never forgive you. Calvin's eyes turned red, staring at my stomach. Come back with me, and I'll forgive you this once. I laughed. Are you joking? I have a loving husband and a child. Why would I go with a jerk like you? Calvin was stunned by my words. I took the opportunity to pull Garrett away. This place is too dangerous. Let's go somewhere else to eat. Garrett protectively held me and agreed. Chapter 8. What happened next? I heard from friends still in the city. After returning, Calvin thoroughly investigated Noelle. Noelle's actions couldn't withstand scrutiny. It turned out Calvin wasn't the only fish in Noelle's pond. To be safe, Noelle had ambiguous relationships with many people in Calvin's circle. The child's paternity was unclear. Calvin was furious and kicked Noelle out of his house after a big fight. Noelle tried to seek refuge with other men, but the news had spread in their circle. Parents warned their children to stay away from Noelle, who had a bad reputation and had broken up white family. Under Calvin's influence, Noelle had no place to stay in the city. She was used to Calvin's support and refused to work for a living. Desperate, she thought of me. She started a live stream, telling a story of how a vicious woman ruined her relationship and caused her to lose her child. She also spread rumors to make money and punish me. For a while, ignorant netizens flooded my social media with insults. Some even found the university I applied to and left messages on the school's website, demanding my admission be cancelled. I quickly contacted Miriam and obtained the surveillance footage from that day. While I was organizing the evidence, Calvin called. Out of respect for Miriam, I answered. Joanna, I'm sorry about Noelle. You've wronged me in many ways. I don't have the energy to argue with you. Don't call me again. I didn't mince words. Calvin hesitated. Joanna, if I give you the surveillance footage, will you forgive me? Huh? His audacity left me speechless. Even if I didn't have the footage, I had other ways to prove it. Calvin and Noelle had never hidden their relationship. He still thought he could use this to threaten me. My silence made Calvin think I was moved. He continued. Seeing Noelle's true colors made me realize your sincerity. You once loved me so much. You can't just stop loving me. Come back to me. I'll deal with Noelle. I hung up, not wanting to hear more nonsense. After posting the evidence online, some people still defended Noelle, but they were quickly silenced by righteous netizens. Noelle had signed some endorsement contracts, but her reputation was now in ruins, and she had to pay huge penalties. After clearing my name, I blocked all of Calvin's contacts and changed my phone number. After returning from studying abroad, I visited Miriam. We had kept in touch over the years without Calvin knowing. Miriam had aged significantly. I thought after you and Calvin got married, I could hand over the company and rest easy. Now I see it's Calvin's loss. I wanted to comfort her, but she waved me off. I've come to terms with it. I was keeping the company for Calvin's father. If it fails under Calvin, so be it. I've worked hard all my life and have no regrets. As we chatted, Calvin returned. Seeing me, his lifeless eyes lit up with joy. Joanna, you're here. I'm here to see Miriam. Hearing this, the light in Calvin's eyes dimmed. He seemed to realize something and smiled bitterly. Of course. After how I treated you, why would you come to see me? I didn't want to stay long. After saying goodbye to Miriam, I left. As I walked out of the yard, I felt a burning gaze on my back, but I didn't look back. Returning home, I found a table of delicious food still steaming. A voice called from the kitchen. You're back. Wash up and eat. I rushed to the kitchen and hugged the person tightly. Dr. Garrett, your cooking smells amazing. Garrett turned around, playfully tapping my nose. You little foodie, stop flattering me. I handed him the test results. Garrett, I used to dream of a life with just the two of us, 3 meals a day, and for seasons. Now, that might not be possible. Garrett's face changed, his expression serious. But after reading the results, his worry turned to joy. It'll be a life for 3. I said. Garrett hugged me tightly. After 2 lifetimes of hardship, happiness had finally found me. When I first met Dr. Garrett at the hospital, I never imagined I would fall for his pursuit and marry him. But I'm glad it was him.